Historically, humans have always tried to control nature. For thousands of years, humans have altered their surroundings. In fact, it's one of our hallmark traits as a species, next to our mastery of fire and subsequently agriculture. Environmental factors such as hurricanes and earthquakes may be out of our control, but we do have a direct effect on other aspects of our ecosystem, such as releasing or controlling exotic species.
Consider the economic and agricultural gains when we introduced European honeybees to North America. The bees not only pollinated our crops, but also sparked a whole economy based around honey. But unlike the bees, the overwhelming majority of animal and plant relocations has had devastating consequences, and this is why we call them invasive species. Most of these animals and plants were released by humans without considering future implications. So, let's take a closer look at these invasive species and what their presence means for our environment on this episode of Off the Trail.
In 1890, a man named Eugene Schieffelin released 60 European starlings into New York City's Central Park. The next year, he did the same with another 40 birds. Schieffelin wanted to introduce the birds mentioned in William Shakespeare's plays to North America. At the time, Schieffelin belonged to the American Acclimatization Society, which was a 19th century group responsible for introducing exotic species into their non-native lands. This practice was considered fashionable and safe at the time, largely because no one understood the potential dangers.
Starlings not only survived, they thrived and became an invasive species. And they also had a new way of flying. They would fly in these huge, tight flocks that twisted and undulated in the skies. And there's even a special name for that, a murmuration of starlings. Their nesting habits were a little bit more aggressive too. They would take over the nests of our native birds. And what we found though was that we could do something to help exclude the starlings and support our native birds again with the nests that we would build. And it was all in the size of the birdhouse entrance hole. And a lot of people were putting in 2-inch holes, or this is a 2.5-inch hole even, and starlings can easily get into something like that. But if we crank it down to 1 3/8 and sizes like in there, then it's too small, it's too tight for the starlings to get in. But it's just the right size for our natives to get in, things like bluebirds and our wrens. So helping out our native species is as easy as using a smaller entrance hole on the next birdhouse that you put up.
There are over 4,000 invasive species of plants, animals, and fungi in the United States alone. One of these, which has affected us right here on Long Island, is the coyote. Unlike most invasive species, coyotes are native to North America, with a natural habitat that extends from Alaska to Central America. Dr. Russell Burke, a professor of biology at Hofstra University, has been studying coyotes on Long Island for many years now.
One of the things about coyotes is that they're often in places where people don't know they exist, and they can live in places where even around a lot of people, and often people don't even know it because coyotes are extraordinarily adaptable, and they learn very quickly to stay away from where people are and to be hidden and to be secretive. Long Island is the last big chunk of the United States that doesn't have coyotes. Every place else has coyotes, and when I say every place, I mean every place. Chicago has coyotes, Los Angeles has coyotes, Miami has coyotes. So, we think about coyotes as being animals of big open green spaces, but they have adapted to living in cities, and New York City is the last major city to be colonized by coyotes. There's no evidence that coyotes were actually here on Long Island. They're mostly a Western species, at least when Europeans got here. They were a Western species, and were rarely seen, probably almost never seen here at the East. This is wolf territory. This is where, there used to be wolves here. And whereas we're used to seeing wolves and coyote together in places in the West, coyotes were very rare here in the East, and there's no real evidence they were ever here on Long Island itself.
As a fellow biologist, I'm completely excited at bringing this on. I mean, I grew up on the eastern plains of Colorado, and I have such fond childhood memories of of sleeping out under the stars, howling with coyotes, and so I'm really excited about that. But I see here on Long Island, there's a completely different reaction that people have when they hear that coyotes could be returning, and you know, I feel like it's one shade away from grabbing your children and your dogs and running inside.
Well, I would point out that coyotes have been spreading east over much of the United States over the last several decades, and lots of places that did not have coyotes before has had coyote populations go from very low numbers or 0 to high numbers just in the last 50 years. And this has been a nation, you know, Eastern United States phenomenon. It's happened over and over and over again, and in every place, people freaked out when this happened. They were very, very, very concerned at first when this happened. And that's, you know, we are afraid of things we don't know about, you know, and when a new animal moves into an area, you know, it's not surprising that lots of people are afraid. There's no question that coyotes are not harmless, you know. They do occasionally take dogs and cats, and there have been a couple of attacks on humans as well. So they're not harmless by any means. However, it's relatively simple to reduce that risk to a very low level. And I would point out that we live in a world where there are much, much, much greater dangers than the risks that we have from coyotes. Most of the negative interactions that people have with any wildlife is because they feed them.
So getting back to invasive, native, non-native issues, like where is that balance of these things? These terms seem to be thrown out, but it's always in my mind at least, a static bubble. And, and to me, environments are not in a static bubble. Ecology is something that's always in flux.
Right.
And so how do you address those topics?
Yeah, I think we tend to try to come up with like rigid definitions for things, and unfortunately in the living world, you know, the living world doesn't like rigid definitions. It moves around those boundaries a lot, and so we might say that some species is non-native if we bring it somewhere either on purpose or by accident. But if it gets there on its own, well then that's natural. And from the species point of view, they don't care whether some human brought them or whether they got there on their own. What they care about is that they got there. From our point of view, I think it makes sense to say what species do we want and what species do we not want.
I'm a little concerned about the high raccoon density that we have here on Long Island, and I've also noticed since I've been here on Long Island, the deer population is marching from Suffolk County well into Nassau County now, and it just seems to go up and up and up as well. And I know the raccoons are having the impacts on our turtle populations because they're eating the eggs. I'm not seeing young turtle recruitment. You know, I'm seeing a lot of older turtles and no young ones. And so there's just this whole multifold effect that these high raccoon and deer populations are having on our ecosystems here on Long Island. What could you predict might happen with a coyote population coming back?
Coyote, we can extrapolate. We can use what we've seen in other places with coyotes to make some predictions about what we're going to see here. Coyotes generally, especially our urban and suburban coyotes, are unlikely to tangle with a raccoon. Raccoons are big, and any dog owner, if your dog has interacted with a coyote, with a raccoon, you know that raccoons are very capable of defending themselves.
I saw firsthand a red fox and a raccoon tangle,
mixing it up.
And the raccoon walked away.
Right, and any vet can tell you that they have seen dogs brought in sometimes cases big dogs brought in to their clinic that have tangled with a raccoon, and it's not a pretty sight.
Wow.
Raccoons usually will convince any dog and any coyote to leave them alone because they're formidable. And so generally, people who look at diet studies of coyotes, they see very little evidence that they're predating on raccoons. Coyotes, like other carnivores, can affect other species indirectly as well. So it doesn't necessarily mean that coyotes have to feed on raccoons to make an effect. The very presence of coyotes can deter raccoons from foraging in places. So it's not necessarily that the coyotes are feeding on the raccoons, it's just the raccoons are afraid of the coyotes and are less willing to be out in the open places a long distance from trees when there are coyotes in the area.
I'm involved with a lot of different community conservation projects. and people want to help.
Yeah.
You know, there's a lot of interested people. Is there something set up yet that if somebody sees something, they could report it?
Absolutely. And so anybody who sees something they think might be a coyote is encouraged to take pictures, of course, and send them to us. You know, we can't have the eyes and ears out there that we would really need to do this right. So people out there, you know, taking pictures of what they see is critical.
It's not just animals that can become invasive species. Plants make up a large proportion of our environment as well, and can be wrongly introduced and wreak havoc on our ecosystems. The most notable example is a vine called bittersweet. It was introduced to North America in 1879 in hopes it would spark an economic boom in the basket-making industry. And while it never achieved this, it did become an invasive species.
Bittersweet is growing here. This is a classic growth pattern for this vine. And as you can see here, it likes a nice sunny start, and it's going to be climbing up something, could be a shrub or a fence in this case, and it's going to jump onto, well, not jump, but it's going to climb onto this tree here. And as you can see, it's completely wrapped that tree. And now this vine is competing for sunlight around this tree. Its roots are competing for water and nutrients from the soil. And eventually it will kill this tree and serve then, this dead tree will now serve as a bridge to the very next tree. And this vine is pretty much ensured that it will take out these trees and extend the edge of the forest back.
While the vicious growth of invasives, such as bamboo, is largely obvious, there are thousands of others that are difficult to distinguish from other plants in your garden. Bonnie Klein, a horticulturalist for the town of North Hempstead, works closely with Clark Botanic Garden to identify and remove local invasive plants.
Well, a native plant has historically been here for many, many years in our ecosystem, meaning our area, let's say Long Island, New York. A non-native plant is indigenous to this area, has not been here. Doesn't mean that it's an invasive plant because it's a non-native plant. An invasive plant is a plant that is non-native, but it causes maybe economic or ecologically causes harm to our ecosystem.
I guess the bigger question might be why? Why should people, the average homeowner or the average citizen, be concerned about these invasive plants?
They take over areas and they kill our native plants. They cause harm to wildlife because they're taking away a lot of the plants and food that could be produced for our wildlife.
And so what means do we have to control these invasives?
There are different means. You could hand pull some invasives, which is almost impossible because they spread. They're called invasives because they spread so rapidly. Or you could use pesticide use, which a lot of people don't want to use pesticides. It's difficult to know that you have them, to get them out of your yard earlier before it spreads is the best way to try to eradicate them. Town of North Hempstead does have an ordinance for bamboo. The golden bamboo is a running bamboo, and that's the one that's causing most of the problems. And it does spread, and it causes a lot of damage to walkways and other people's yards when you're on property lines. And if you're going to have it, or you do have it, you have to put a barrier around it so it doesn't spread into your neighbor's yard.
I guess that could be rather expensive to install such a barrier.
Yes.
And I know from my own experience that just because you're going to a place that's selling plants and buying them doesn't necessarily mean they're always legal. I once came across a store that was selling bittersweet in pots. So I went and talked to the manager there and kind of got brushed off. But I went back there the next day and they were all pulled.
Were gone.
So it kind of made me think, I'm like, do you know if that one is?
Yeah, bittersweet is a prohibited plant. It's on the do not sell list.
Okay.
There is a list for Nassau and Suffolk County, New York State. You can go online and there's a list showing plants that are not for sale. You can't transport them, you can't propagate them. Well, there are many non-native plants that people use in their landscapes. We have here at the Clark Botanic Garden, and we use it for ornamental purposes. It's for beauty, and there's so many that you use just like a palette when you're painting. That you want to bring in and show off and just enjoy. And it's important to know that these are non-invasive plants, and they do provide food for wildlife as well. There's a lot of different types of non-native plants that do provide food for wildlife and are fine to use.
So welcome back to the show, Judi.
Well, it's wonderful to be here.
Yes, thank you. And so I brought in a friend of mine here. This is Tui, and this is a red ear slider. And it's not native to New York. But what we're finding, though, is that people get these turtles, and as it turns out, they grow quite large. And there are a lot of upkeep to keep them in the house and stuff. So a lot of times people just say, let's just take it to the local pond and let it go.
So I've heard about them, I've read about them, I have not seen one. And I can see Tui is actually a very friendly red-eared slider, but I know they don't like to be touched, so I'm gonna let you hold. And from what I understand, they're a little bit of a bully. So they are bullying our native turtles, and so the plea from this segment should be, please, if you decide to get a red-eared slider as a pet, please do not release them into our ponds because they are taking over, and that's not good for our native turtles.
That's right. I always ask people to do the research, look and see what you're getting. You know, this animal can live 40 years. You're making a decision for the next 40 years. These guys are, they do eat some plants, but they mostly eat they love snails and little fishes and...
So I guess the thing that we're stressing here is that they become competition for our native turtles, and so we're pretty partial to our native turtles, and it's not easy to exist in the wild, but we don't want to be making it more difficult than it has to be.
Exactly. So I'm sure red-eared sliders aren't the only invasive species that you're dealing with in the town. What other things do you have that you're looking at?
So there are animal invasive species, but we do have plant invasive species. At Clark, particularly we have Nymphoides, and they actually look like a water lily, and so you could say, well, what's wrong with that? Water lilies are beautiful.
Right.
And they are, but this particular kind of water lily, this Nymphoides, actually just continues to grow and grow and grow. They start covering the pond, and then sunlight can't get into the pond, and the pond needs that.
Right.
So we are very fortunate because we have a group of wonderful students from Chaminade High School, and they come each year and they actually go into the pond and they help get rid of the Nymphoides, and so that's a good thing. We also have cattails, and again, they're lovely, but they spread like wildfire. We also have something that's very challenging to deal with. So we actually enacted a law preventing people from planting bamboo in the town of North Hempstead. It's difficult because the roots grow horizontally, so they really do spread out. So in fact, again, in North Hempstead, you're not allowed to plant bamboo. If you have it, it's your responsibility to keep it under control.
Great. That's good that you're keeping these under control like that, and hand pulling is, of course, so much better for the environment than coming in with herbicides or something like that to try to control these species. So I appreciate that.
You know that we are all about finding natural ways of controlling any population that we think shouldn't be there. So whether it's mosquitoes, we have the wonderful bat houses in Clark Gardens, and the bats eat the mosquitoes, and you've been so instrumental in helping us with our bobwhite quails.
Yes.
We've released those on the Hempstead Harbor Trail, and of course the quails eat ticks. And anything that we can do to control these populations using natural means, as opposed to pesticides that are toxins that ultimately get into our groundwater, is what we're aiming to do.
Invasives are a daunting group of plants and animals to control. Our government works tirelessly to keep these species under control using a number of tactics, including water weed pulls, open harvesting, hunting seasons, and even goat grazes. Unfortunately, invasive species often have no predators or natural way to keep their populations in check. But by keeping our native animals healthy and diverse, we can try to mitigate the damage caused by invasives and restore our ecosystem.
And even on a local level here on Long Island, our efforts have already produced results. We are beginning to see a resurgence of native animals such as bald eagles, whales, and even river otters. So if you'd like to learn more about invasive species or what you can do about them, please visit me at yc2n.com. And to watch full episodes of Off the Trail, you can visit mynhtv.com. So until next time, I'm Ranger Powers, and I'll see you off the trail.